And thank you so much for joining us. I think we're about 2 minutes past, so I'm going to go ahead and get started and hope that people continue to trickle in. I'm really pleased to welcome you all to this webinar and really pleased to get to share the stage with our wonderful guests. I'm actually going to go ahead and share some slides so that we can all be looking at the same thing. Let me introduce myself. My name is Malika. I run Learning and Insights for Catalyst Fund, which is a startup accelerator at BFA Global. And as part of my work, I've been supporting the Digital Finance for Climate Resilience Task Force, which I'm going to introduce in just a second. I think the important place to start our conversation today is around the impacts of climate change. And as we've been hearing throughout the past week and going forward, into the conversations around COP26, climate change isn't an issue of the future. It's something that's happening today. And what we're seeing is that those who are most exposed to the risks of climate change are also those who are least equipped and least prepared to deal with those changes. So what you see on this slide is some sort of headline statistics about who's really facing and bearing the brunt of climate change risks and climate change threats. So of course, we can think about those who depend on nature-based livelihoods, people like farmers, for example, who stand the most to lose from unpredictable rainfall or increased temperatures, but are simultaneously also more likely to be poor and vulnerable, meaning that they live in houses without ventilation or without sanitation, therefore compounding the risk of higher temperatures and floods, et cetera. I think thanks to events like COP26, we're having more conversations and raising awareness around these issues. And we were really pleased to see that recognition highlighted a UN resolution that recognized a sustainable and healthy environment as a human right, just not just 2 weeks ago. From our perspective, I think, this picture is really sad and really difficult to deal with. But there's also potentially good news, which is that there are solutions to help vulnerable people manage, mitigate, adapt to climate change risks. The difficulty is that these solutions are just not reaching those folks who need them, right? Affordability is weak. These populations tend to be remote, without access to markets, and providers face a huge range of both demand side and supply side barriers in reaching them. Seeing this picture, with the support of PayPal, BFA Global pulled together the Digital Finance for Climate Resilience Task Force. And what it is a group of experts on both the climate change as well as financial inclusion worlds coming together to say, how can digital finance help vulnerable people build resilience? And as part of the task force work, we commissioned a series of primary research efforts in South Africa, Nigeria, and Mexico. And we're really pleased today to share some of the results, some of the findings of that research. Our hope is that hearing stories and perspectives from people on the ground, people who are actually experiencing these changes, we'll be better able to think about solutions, to think about what really matters in helping people deal with the impact of climate change. Before we actually dive into the panel, I'm happy to turn the mic to Sri Shavananda, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Technology Officer for PayPal, who will deliver some opening remarks for our session.
Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to join you virtually to listen and learn more about climate change. In particular, today we have the opportunity to hear the powerful stories of lives and livelihoods that are adapting to climate change. Without a doubt, climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our time, and learning opportunities like this one are critical to catalyzing the action that is urgently needed. I'm honored to help with introducing this event, since the voices, needs, and the realities faced by vulnerable people in their community need to be heard at events like COP26. As member of the Digital Finance for Climate Resilience Task Force, PayPal recognizes the tremendous opportunity for digital finance industry to deliver resilient solutions to financially underserved communities who are amongst the most exposed to the impacts of climate change. PayPal is dedicated to ensuring everyone has access to affordable, convenient, and secure products and services to take control of their financial lives. We know that the experience of the people we aim to serve must be at the heart of any meaningful financial service solution for building their climate resilience as well. The customers' research that Malika mentioned a moment ago reveals important insights in this regard. For example, nearly 3/4 of small-scale producers interviewed for the research have experienced at least one climate stress or shock in the past 2 years. Access to digital finance tools was clearly identified as an enabler for these small-scale producers to protect their livelihoods against any future climate-related extreme events. We are excited about the potential of our digital services to contribute to United Nations Race to Resilience goal of building the climate resilience for 4 billion people by 2030. Financial health is central to an inclusive and equitable global climate transition and an important driver for achieving sustainable development goals. We are humbled by this chance to learn how our fintech platform can better enable customers to prepare for these disasters, adapt their livelihoods, and bring long-term resilience. And we are looking forward to partnering and helping to scale digital finance innovations for climate resilience. We invite you to join more than 50 organizations that have already contributed to this task force work and are taking action on the task force's most important recommendations. And now I'll turn the floor back to Malika to introduce our speakers and guide our learning agenda for this session. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to sort of go straight along so we have a lot of time for discussion later. And what I'm going to ask is that our panelists go ahead and introduce themselves. I can tell you that I'm thrilled to be sharing the stage with them and giving them the chance to tell us about what they found. We had a practice conversation a couple of days ago, and it's kept me thinking in the 48 hours since. So with that, Barbara, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, thank you. My name is Barbara Magnoni. I run and manage EA Consultants, which is a consulting firm that looks at the lives of low-income customers, as well as the business models that serves them and comes up with solutions to better serve low-income communities, particularly around financial inclusion. And for this conversation, I'm also co-founder of Noawi Soluciones, which is the firm that gathered a lot of the qualitative research in Mexico with farmers on the BFA projects. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Barbara. Greg, can I ask you to go next?
So unmuting myself. So everyone, Greg Duggan from Abalobi in Cape Town, South Africa. We're a startup working in the small-scale fisheries sector around the world.
Venu?
I'm Venu Aggarwal. I work for a company called 60 Decibels that does customer-centric measurement, and I lead our work in agriculture.
And Kehkashan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kehkashan. I am a United Nations Human Rights Champion and founder president of Global Social Innovation Enterprise Green Hope Foundation, which works across 25 countries to empower our world's most vulnerable communities in the sustainable development process. And today I'm connecting with you from Glasgow, where I'm in person at COP26.
So exciting. Thank you so much. So what I'm proposing for our time today together is that I spend a little bit of time with Barbara, Greg, and Venu discussing the results from the research, and then we'll turn the mic over to Kehkashan to sort of prime us for what comes next and what our course of action is as a community. So with that, let's dive right in. And what I want to do is actually start by hopefully painting a more colorful, more rigorous, more research-based picture of who these folks are that we're actually talking about. And we're really lucky that, that 3 of our panelists do this for a living, actually consider who these people are, what the problems are that they face, how to craft solutions that really work for them. And there's some headline stats that I think are helpful, like the ones we started the talk with, that 80% of poor people live in rural areas and are dependent on agriculture, that in fact poor people are also those who we rely on to extract from nature what we depend on as as a globe and as a community, whether it's from the soil or from forests or from agriculture. And we know that not only do poor people mediate that relationship between the rest of the world and nature, but it's their greatest source of wealth, right? So there's these amazing statistics that sort of a quarter of wealth in developing nation, a quarter of developing nations' wealth is actually in natural resources, whereas that number is maybe only 2 or 3% in OECD countries. So what that means is that these folks are both extremely dependent on natural resources, but also the stewards of our globe's natural resources. And with that, what I'd love to do is actually ask our panelists to tell us a little bit more about the climate vulnerable population that you study, and give us a little bit more of an understanding about how they depend on natural resources, how they serve as stewards for those natural resources, so that we have just a better picture of who we're talking about. Greg, I'm going to start with you.
Cool. Thanks, Malika. So at Abalobi, we work with small-scale fishers across a wide range of contexts, but the communities we've worked with the most are in our home country of South Africa. And in South Africa, small-scale fishers depend very heavily on marine resources that they harvest for, and they rely on them for both food and income security. These are most often rural, isolated, and largely impoverished communities where access to supporting infrastructure, medical facilities, and other resources is extremely limited. And their work is really strongly influenced by both seasonal and daily weather patterns and entirely dependent on favorable conditions. If you look at the coast of South Africa, for example, it's notorious for having incredibly difficult and dangerous sea conditions. So in all, being a small-scale fisher in this context is really a tough livelihood.
I'm on mute. Barbara, can I ask you to tell us a little bit about the farmers in Mexico that your team spoke with?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I wanted to start with, you have some averages here that are really interesting and I think important. It is a male-focused sector in Mexico, and somewhat younger than maybe we see in other countries. But what I'll focus on a little bit is the fact that farmers are not all one segment, they're not all alike, and they don't face the same challenges and risks as a result. So our research spanned a really broad type of farmer, from a man named Isidoro who was married, he's 58 years old, he's hypertense, he takes blood pressure medicine, very vulnerable in terms of depending completely on his crops and his whole family depending on his crops for income. Talks about a variety of risks, from climate risks that we're all talking about today, including flooding and some drought, but also things around his own illness and health, around the cost of inputs being really high, supply chain concerns, and price fluctuations, which is one of his bigger concerns. And then we can kind of go, and he has a very low level of education. I would say he's high school educated, or kind of low-level high school educated. The research spans all the way to a man named Marco, who's much younger, 36 years old, also married. And he is very interesting because he has a master's in agronomy. So you can see how much more technified and kind of capable he is. Also, because of the master's degree, in addition to farming, he has a job as an agricultural extension worker, which provides a little bit of cushion in his household in case things don't go the way they do. But what I think is also important to highlight is that even with those advantages that he might face, he's incredibly conscious and aware of certain risks. So he talks about how he has very little liquidity. It's hard for him to often exploit the land that he has because he doesn't have access to credit to provide to buy all the inputs that he needs at the time he needs during all the crop cycles that he can plant. He also suffered from a big flood 2 years ago, which hurt his household economy, and has had 3 droughts in the last couple of years, one of which led to a 50% reduction in his output. So, even though he seems maybe at first glance a little bit more resilient, still really vulnerable to these climate risks.
That's really helpful. It was interesting to me that in both of the fisher and the farmer cases that we looked at here, having access to certain kinds of inputs and certain kinds of tools allows folks to mitigate a lot of their vulnerabilities, right? So I think, Greg, one of the things we found with the fishers is if you have a fridge, that you can store your fish in, then you can maybe look for a better price or wait till tomorrow for a better price. Or if you have a boat that's slightly bigger, you can get farther out to sea, and access other kinds of fishery contexts that those without those kinds of assets can't. Do you want to, yeah, go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there are those little nuances and subtleties that really advantage certain players in the sector. On the whole, the level of infrastructure and resources available to small scale fishers, not just in South Africa, but all around the world, are very low compared to industrialized fisheries. So anything like, as you mentioned there, a fridge or a freezer capability, for example, is obviously a high cost to maintain, but it's also the trade-off is significant in giving them a market advantage, or just being able to store their fish for another day and sell it on at a better price or at a later date if they can't sell it on the day. Yeah. Those are the strategies that are key to mitigate variability and risk especially in the short term.
Okay, I want to circle back to this question about like sort of what these game changer interventions could be. But before we do that, I want to sort of give Venu a chance to again do some of this stage setting. I think we're really lucky that Venu, sitting at 60 decibels, has a kind of global perspective on some of this research, but also recently conducted an incredible, maybe first of its kind of study about the impacts of COVID on farmers in Kenya. And while COVID is perhaps not exactly a climate change, I think there's arguments to be made there, climate change impact certainly is instructive in terms of thinking about how vulnerable people deal with shocks and deal with risks. So Venu, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks, Malika. And I think Barbara and Greg have done a really good job of giving examples that help us understand how farmers depend on natural resources and why that makes them vulnerable to climate shocks. So I agree, I should pivot a little bit to what farmers' experience of this shock might look like. Malika mentioned this. We recently published a report called 8 Things We Learned from Kenyan Farmers During COVID-19. It's based on 6,000 phone conversations we had with Kenyan farmers from the beginning of the pandemic and when there were the strictest lockdowns in Kenya around June 2020. For 12 months, we continued the research for 12 months through May 2021. And while COVID-19 was an unusual shock that affected everyone, farmers live through similar shocks on a regular basis. So I just want to share a couple of main lessons that we learned from their experience of COVID-19. So when COVID-19 first hit rural areas, we saw that what was most interesting as well as alarming is that income diversity went away fastest. 1 in 4 farmers that we spoke to lost at least one source of income. And rural women were actually more likely to report losses in income because they tend to work in agriculture supply chains and then also parts of agriculture supply chains that require social distancing, like packaging, like transporting, harvest to a nearby location, and things that that couldn't be done because there were lockdowns. What we also saw was that in the face of income diversity going away, farmers were relying a lot more on their farms, not just for food, but also for a source of income. And what they wanted and kept reinforcing month after month in this 12-month-long research is that they needed liquidity, they needed timely access to inputs, and they needed timely access to markets, which are the kinds of things that come up quite often in the context of any climate shock, and if you do research in that context. What was also interesting, and we were sort of fortunate to have had a chance to make the most of what COVID-19 was for the world, was that we were able to do this research for 12 months, which allowed us to see longer term impacts of a shock like this. And that's often not studied because people say a drought hit farmers. And there's a lot of research that's done immediately after, but like really what happens a year after that? And we were able to look at some of that. When we started the research in June 2020, this was again after the strictest lockdowns, 43% of the respondents were using multiple coping strategies. And this included sort of savings, borrowing from family, borrowing from other sources, and a bunch of other coping strategies. But the fact here that they were using multiple coping strategies actually increases when you look at May 2021. So 63% of farmers were using multiple coping strategies, which could be a proxy for continued, if not worsened, financial strife. And we also saw that farmers were using riskier coping strategies towards the end. So at the end, 51% of farmers were borrowing compared to 39% at the beginning. And 34% said that they had sold an asset compared to 11% at the beginning. So just a few reflections on what the actual lived experience of a shock like this could be for farmers.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's both incredibly sobering, but also really, really interesting. I mean, I think that one of the things that already strikes me from what I'm hearing from you guys is that the coping and sort of management mechanisms aren't necessarily the ones that would first come to mind, right? I think a lot of times when we see like people are exposed to risk, we think get them an insurance policy. But what I hear from you guys say is like, well, it's not just about insurance policy. Like, folks are coming up with other ways of managing their risks. And sometimes it's about prevention at the front end or assets at the front end. Sometimes it's about those immediate responses, access to cash, access to materials as soon as a shock hits. What I'd love to do now is sort of ask you to reflect a little bit on what these coping mechanisms are. So how are people managing risks in their real lives? Because it's not through insurance policies or the savings account that I started in high school or whatever. So what does that really look like for the folks that we're talking about here today? And Greg, maybe I'll start with you.
Thanks, Malika. So as I mentioned earlier, small-scale fishers are really trying to survive in a harsh environment. So in terms of markets, policies, and the physical environment. So to be honest, they're mostly reactive resources they have, and you'll find as a result that family units in particular are usually the first thing that people rely on, simply because they offer a means often of diversifying income. So you'll find that there'll be a fisher in the household, and then someone else within the home will be working in a different sector. So generally the family unit is the foundation in a lot of these fisher communities for generating strategies. And then what we've been able to do as Abalobi is work with the fishers hand in hand to co-create solutions that actually address their biggest challenges. So something like training in financial literacy or the ability to log their catches and expenses enables them to take control of their finances and improves their market access. So helping people to help themselves to move beyond acting as pure price takers in the market and giving visibility, but really working with them to generate that from the ground up. This is a really sort of practical, functional solution that we've seen work, especially during COVID as well.
Barbara, I know I've heard you say similar things before about the importance of working with people, creating solutions from the ground up, and not just sort of importing things that seem to have worked.
Yeah, and I think it has to be very specific to the risks, because different risks have different sort of ideal strategies and different ways that people can access coping. So price risk, which is a big one, in the case of the research we did, was really interesting because the model that we were studying involved a beer company that was guaranteeing certain prices for producers in advance based on certain quality expectations, but it gave them a certain certainty about how much they were going to be selling their product for, which is a nice opportunity to manage some of the price risk. Of course, it's also incredibly narrow, right? It's just one product, one crop, and one situation, and it doesn't solve all of the price fluctuation issues, but it was a useful one. Climate risk is tricky though, because it's covariate often, right? And so this
you're gonna have to unpack some of this vocabulary, Barbara.
Yeah, of course. But like, Greg talks about friends and family helping you out. Well, if the entire area that you live in, which is most likely where your friends and family also live, is impacted by a similar climate risk, then they are much less resilient as well and less able to help you out. And so the smaller farmer that I was mentioning to you earlier, Isidoro, he does depend on friends and family when things don't work out. But there is that risk. And so, to the extent that some family moves into urban areas and sends money home to rural areas, that can help. But it does really speak to the incredible vulnerability of that strategy when we're looking at climate risks in particular, and to the need to kind of come up with different coping mechanisms. And in Mexico specifically, consumer credit is very widespread and reaches very far into rural areas. And so what we did find is that small consumer loans through retail companies and kind of somewhat predatory providers are also an ex post solution to a climate event or any kind of shock in their crop. And obviously it's not the ideal solution because they're very costly. The amount is determined by, sort of a credit risk algorithm that is not related to your needs as a farmer, but it's often all there is.
Yeah. Venu, I want to give you a chance to comment on this before but I'm going to seed a question for our next round, which is around sort of the good, bad, and the ugly around financial services and the role they have in dealing with risk, both preparing for risk and dealing with it afterwards. But before we get there, Venu, I'm going to turn it to you.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And I think there's no substitute for timely cash infusion. And that's what we heard again, every single month that we spoke to farmers, they were asking for cash. Initially, and when the lockdown was the worst, it was correlated with need for food. During the times when they were investing in their farm and planting, it was correlated to access to inputs. And then when they were trying to sell, it was correlated to not having enough market access. So I think it's just liquidity and the various use cases of cash are just so important. And I almost want to step back a little bit or zoom out a little bit because I think you're all financial experts. What I'm bringing to the table is a little bit of the discourse from the agriculture space. And so thinking about this from an agriculture lens, what is really happening or what happened during COVID-19 was that farmers were bearing the brunt of higher prices on both ends. So agro dealers were transferring higher prices that they were having to pay for inputs to farmers. And SMEs or FPOs or all these smaller last mile organizations that are traditionally purchasing farmers' produce were actually transferring higher costs to farmers. And so farmers were paying more, getting less, which is really interesting because food prices in the world were increasing. So it was like this really funny dynamic of what was going on. That needs to be parsed through a little bit. But what was interesting is if these SMEs, last mile organizations, could have had timely cash to keep them going, that would have helped them provide inputs to farmers at an affordable rate, to procure from farmers at an affordable rate. And it's just really that, timely cash infusion. And there were a couple of things that were kind of coming in the way. If you look at the SME research on this, it really seems like a lot of money was being pumped into the system, but it was going through larger financial institutions, which for good reason have a lot of responsible lending protocols in place. But what was really needed and is often needed in these situations is like an emergency relief approach, which isn't thought about as much when you think about climate crisis. Right? And that's where insurance doesn't step in because farmers often don't get insurance payments on time. And then there's the whole aspect of accountability for this capital. So there isn't a lot of capital that is transferred to these last mile distributors by way of working capital. There's some incredible work being done under CSAF, Council for Smallholder Agriculture Finance, just trying to work out how to get this capital to farmers at the right time, SMEs at the right time. But I think accountability as well on how that capital is used. So if an SME is getting more money because food prices are going up, is that actually being used to reduce the burden on the farmer? So there's just a few reflections on how responsible lending, responsible infusion of cash and timely infusion of cash to last mile SMEs could actually have helped them do the job they usually do, and might have served the same purpose as unconditional cash transfer or insurance payouts to farmers.
Thank you, Venu. I mean, it's fascinating because it's clear that financial services have an central role to play. And I think that what I'm hearing is that the speed of those financial services matters a lot, where they're located and how easily they're deployed against those specific needs matters a lot. Targeting matters a lot, if they're getting to the right person. I don't hear a lot about like the price. Barbara, you mentioned a little bit, but I'd be interested to hear like sort of how important we think cost of money or we talk a lot about transfer fees, for example. But I'll now turn to the panel to say, let's ideate a little bit on what the real role is for financial services and what are the best practices we should be looking for and what are the real red flags we should be aware of. We use words like predatory credit, we use words like loan sharks or payday lending, but in practice, when we're really thinking about solutions, what matters, what works? Barbara, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, and the first thing I'll say about predatory or credit or high, I mean, Mexico has very high interest rates, undisputably high, 70 to 130% ranges of interest rate, which will be, everyone can agree is very high and really cuts into your margin as a farmer or any other, borrower out there. So they're definitely not ideal, and yet farmers do rely on those services, and for many of the reasons that you mentioned, Malika, that they're available, they're quick, they're relatively transactionally easy to access. You don't need a lot of documentation, and all of those things are also really important. And ultimately, the opportunity cost of not planting is pretty high, right? So you want to keep your land used, even if you end up making almost nothing on that land. It's better than not using the land, and making sure that your suppliers still know that you're there, that your buyers know that you're there, and kind of staying active. And to be honest, a lot of times people say, this is all I know how to do, I got to keep going, and that's why they use those services. I do a lot of work in insurance, and price does matter a lot, but I think it also has to do with product fit. Sometimes insurance is just such a narrow solution to a much broader set of risks. And so to say, I'm going to tie up my capital to insure against drought or heavy rainfall, when my risks, as I mentioned earlier, vary from price to illness to weather to supply chain to all these other things, well, that may not be the most efficient way that I see tying up my capital. And, the projects that I've worked on with climate insurance that have been most successful so far do rely on a certain level of government or external subsidy to try to mitigate some of that cost and make those products more accessible. One solution that I think is not used sufficiently and can be embedded into a lot of other products, including credit and insurance, is just having greater access to information. And I'll say it's not used very much, even though I know that there have been some really interesting experiences in Kenya in particular, and some other countries, particularly in Africa though, and Latin America really lacks those solutions. So farmers really want to know, climate is changing, they know that. So, when is the frost coming? When is the rain coming? Is there a better time to plant? Should I plant a little bit sooner than I normally do in my normal kind of annual cycle? And having access to timely information can be really complementary and helpful as a suite of services. And of course, some of that is challenged by connectivity. A lot of the farmers that we spoke to do not have Wi-Fi access and maybe are not even within cell phone reach. And so, how to get that information to people is still a question. We spoke about almanacs the other day, but this idea that farmers historically have used almanacs to plan their planting is important and valuable. But the reality is that you can't publish a year in advance anymore what's going to happen, because our climate is not predictable anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. So, I mean, I think we're really lucky to have Barbara on and leading the charge on research and information and understanding. But Greg, who is a researcher by training, but sits in a really privileged position, actually being an innovator on the ground and delivering solutions. And I think one of the things that's really fascinating about the Abalobi model is that it started with exactly the kind of information that Barbara is talking about, right? It started with fishers need to know where the fish are, and restaurants and buyers want to know what kind, when the fish was caught and by whom, and want to know that it's sustainable, and that information both helps the fisher, but also sort of gets them access to a higher price market that closes the loop on some of these resilience and vulnerability issues. And Greg, I think for you guys, maybe financial services are sort of a supporting act to that primary function. I don't know if you would agree with that depiction.
Yeah, I think so. Look, it's an incredibly important topic for fishers because they tend to lack access to formal financial services and insurance, just by virtue of their highly informal conventional means of operating. And so what happens is, Barbara, you referred earlier to predatory lending. That's very commonplace in a lot of small scale fisheries in South Africa and beyond, where you'll have typically fish buyers and middle persons, traders, who offer, frankly, extortionate loans to small scale fishers and keep them as price takers in the market. So I think, what's really needed to address that, and I should backtrack and say, lenders are understandably wary, as are insurers, of a highly informal sector with variable levels of income. And so what we're trying to do is really work with fishers to give them the means to start logging their catches and their finances and creating data in a digital footprint. And once you have that established, you build that bridge to a more formal operating model, and then you can start teasing out these conversations with financial service providers and insurers. So it's a bit of a stepwise process, but we're getting there.
Yeah, and I think in both of the cases you guys are discussing, the financing is really tightly tied to who your suppliers are and who your buyers are. Know that it's not like some independent kind of layer that gets thrown on top, and that question of tailoring is understanding the financing in connection, Venu, as you were saying, to like that right supply at the right time, and the right access to market at the right time. Venu, I wonder if I could ask you to do a little bit more, give us a little bit more depth on the sort of good financing and the kind of financing that we want to be quite concerned about.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I feel like a good way to approach it might be, or if you'd be okay with me, going down the route of exploring the digital aspect of digital financing a little bit more. I'd like to begin there, and then I can loop back into what's good financing versus bad financing, and bring Barbara and Craig into it. Because I think there was a pretty clear trend in what we saw about the potential of digital, and also how we can prepare better for digital financing as being the solution. I mean, we asked farmers if they were using cell phones more during the pandemic, and only a third said that they had actually increased their usage of cell phones, even for personal purposes. And a third had actually reduced their usage. Women were, of course, less likely to increase usage, and they said this was because they didn't have access to a device. And the biggest increase in usage was mobile money. It was, Kenya, farmers are used to that. Very few increased their use of mobile phones for livelihoods, right? So to sell or buy produce. And I think it's easy for us to assume that tech is the solution. It's just that tech might not be the solution that farmers need in the time of crisis, unless they're used to using that tech. And that requires a lot of sort of advanced planning, of socializing solutions, testing what good financing is versus what bad financing might be. And to answer your question, Malika, about what is good finance versus bad finance, and to club that with tech, I think what is good is what works for the farmer. And what works for the farmer is a solution that's designed based on their needs. And the first need for the farmer is timely cash. And so if you, like, across all of our work, if I focus on the projects that we've done for organizations that purchase produce from farmers, the biggest complaint is that I didn't get paid on time. If I look at solutions which are focused on insurance, it is the uncertainty as well as the delays in insurance payments. So it really is the timeliness that works the most. The second thing is, of course, like I'm belaboring a point that that everyone here knows possibly, but it is a solution that is designed for them. And by that, I mean, what are the crops that they're growing, right? What are the risks that they experience? And hence, what kind of payouts would actually be useful to them? And Barbara and Greg might be better suited to actually comment on what the specifics of that looks like. But that's what I read all the time, like timeliness as well as customization of solutions. And then a little bit of a plug for what Barbara is saying by way of information and predictability. I think a lot of what is good finance isn't just about the actual product, but it's also about the comfort and the trust that farmers have in the provider. And that comes from communication. So just having that one line that they can give a missed call to, and they'll get a call back from the provider to say, what's the issue you're facing? Or like a chat bot that can tell them something about when the next rain is going to be. So just like investing in that kind of customer service can make finance better and work better for farmers.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think going back to our starting point around climate risk and climate resilience, I think we've come a long way. We're saying that, folks are not just vulnerable to climate risk; they're vulnerable to a whole set of threats based on their socioeconomic position, and that climate is sort of just compounding that relationship, that exposure, the lack of market access, the lack of a safety net, et cetera. The fact that everybody around you is experiencing the exact same shocks you are at the exact same time, that you're experiencing them as a community, but that the solutions are not always obvious, right? That they have to be extremely context specific, extremely sensitive to timing, and extremely clear and comfortable for the user, right? It has to be something where, as Venu was saying, that you can pick up the phone, or how to use the phone, or how to use the chat bot, because otherwise things are just not going to get used, or not going to get used in the right way. I should have said this at the top of the hour, but there's a question and answer function here. So anybody who would like to post something to the panel, I'll be happy to sort of relay the question forward. While we have maybe a time for one more round of comments before I turn it to Kehkashan. And the question I think, or the opportunity we have, is really to say to the audience, what is the digital finance for climate resilience solution that really matters for the folks that we care about? And I really appreciate what you're saying about, like, let's focus on the things that matter, that are really going to help people at the time that they need it. And I know, Barbara and Greg, that you've seen things that work, and they're not always obvious. And I wonder if you might just have a few words of inspiration as we think about how to move forward. Barbara, I'll ask you to go first.
Sure. So the company that did the research, actually, their main function in Mexico is to digitize local small businesses and individuals and introduce them to fintech products and onboard them and promote their usage. And so we're very familiar with some of the challenges of getting low-income and excluded clients digitized in Mexico in particular. And the challenges are many. I think that one thing with farmers that we have to keep in mind is that, connectivity is still a challenge, and that we can't assume a digital solution for everybody, because that will exclude. And thus, any digital solution we come up with has to be segmented, and has to involve a certain level of physical presence and touch particularly in those groups that either because of connectivity or perhaps other barriers that might be more around trust or comfort levels are not going to get on board right away. And you don't want to leave them out as you move toward a digital solution. You want to kind of grab your easy customers digitally and then work toward digitizing the others through a greater touch solution. And I feel very strongly about that, because when we talk about digital financial services, we think about it as an inclusion strategy, but it can actually turn into an exclusion strategy if we don't do it carefully. And that's really important. I did want to say something about insurance, though, because this idea of speed is really critical. And only offering insurance digitally isn't going to solve the speed problem. The speed problem is an operational problem in the structure of insurance products, both indemnity and parametric products that exist in the market today. And while digital finance can help deposit a claim into an account, that transaction process is not the reason things are slow. The reason things are slow is because there's a verification process in both types of insurance that continues to be constrained operationally, that makes it very slow to identify whether a customer should be receiving a claim benefit. In indemnity products, that requires a physical, sometimes photographic, but primarily physical visit to the farm, which can take a really long time to mobilize. With parametric products, it requires a lot of data validation and verification, and certain levels of operational processes that can also take a long time. So we haven't really seen products respond to this fast payment of customers. And what happens when you're a farmer and you're waiting for an insurance payment is that you can't touch anything else. You can't replant until that verification is done. And so you're sitting around waiting for your insurance payment to take place when you could be planting and kind of regenerating income. So digital is a partial solution. It can help with the verification, it can help with the payment, but there's some operational issues that we still haven't figured out in insurance that keep that product slow and make it subpar as a result.
Thanks. Venu, can I ask you, like, when I say digital finance for climate resilience, what comes to mind?
I mean, just timely cash infusion comes to mind.
Yeah.
I can't emphasize enough the importance of that. And Barbara has done such a fantastic job of laying out operationally why that is such a challenge.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I mean, and a lot of credit, I think, to PayPal for recognizing that, the importance of that, and being the leader in making that happen globally. I think we're really privileged that, they're here in the conversation and understand the importance of that. Yeah. Greg, for you?
I think, again, we're sort of right at the beginning of this journey into finance and insurance. So just zooming out maybe from our experience in the field, I'd like to just mention that, amongst the stakeholders and fishers we work with, we have to acknowledge that people on the ground have developed this highly attuned local ecological knowledge. And so often I think we, as organizations, we're tempted to come in with really cool ideas and overlook local perspectives and insights. And so I think there are sort of, there are 4 steps that I think that we've learned that are kind of essential to building these, building the foundation upon which we can then develop subsequent products, whether they're financial or insurance based. I think the first is capacity building and training. So we need to enhance the stakeholders' ability to properly engage with products. For example, it's no good offering someone the latest tech or product if they don't know how to use it and get the most out of it. So I think that's the first thing, is actually capacitating people. And then tied closely to that, Venu mentioned it already, but it's co-design, engaging people on the ground as co-creating partners and developing solutions with them that actually work for them, so that your final product is something that reflects their lived experience and needs. And then the third step for us, I think, is enabling stakeholders to collect data themselves. because once they're at that point of collecting data, then we can work, hand in hand with them to understand what challenges they're facing, and then again co-create from that basis, and create these functional products. Then lastly, I think there's an important step that a lot of solutions miss out, and that for us is building organizational capacity. And it sounds fairly straightforward, but if you unpack it, I think you're far better positioned to create mitigation strategies or come together and engage with financial products and insurance products when you're operating as a group versus the individual who finds it much harder to weather the storm of climate change or engage with the financial sector. And so what we've seen through our work is you need to work collaboratively with people on the ground and actually help assist them in creating functional organizations.
Yeah, I love that. And I think actually that's the perfect setup for Kehkashan, who is doing exactly that work of bringing people together on the ground, mobilizing them around a message and around a course of action. And so with that, I will give her the mic to close us out today.
Thank you very much, Malika, and hello again, everyone. And I shall just begin by sharing my screen. Okay, I am assuming that my slides are visible. Okay, so I'm really here to talk about the importance of climate justice in building forward equal. And it was really heartening to note that all of my fellow panelists highlighted the importance of ground level work and localized actions, because that is exactly what we advocate for as well. And it's just wonderful to hear what just reiterated how important these localized ground level actions are. And, while I'm speaking to you, sitting here in this warm, comfortable space, and just like all of us, where we are able to connect digitally across the span of a microsecond, we really must count our blessings as being the fortunate few who've had access to education, who can choose what to wear, who we can, decide to be in this discussion and speak our mind. But even as we're having this discussion right now, there are millions of people, and most of them women and girls, who have none of these luxuries. And they are the ones who suffer from the thoughtless and selfish actions, primarily of the Western world, whether it's from the monstrosity of anthropogenic climate change or from the pandemic, a combination of both that just amplifies social inequities as well. So it's really an unequal world where every calamity, heaps greater misery on these hapless souls, pushing them further and further into the mire of poverty and exclusion. And it's really within these regions that my work focuses on empowering them through education and empathetic education, so that ultimately they will decide the power of their own destiny. So my calling came 14 years ago when, as a 7-year-old, I saw this image of a dead bird with its belly full of plastic. I was extremely disturbed by this, because I realized even then that that wasn't normal. And then I had attended a lecture by environmentalist Robert Swan, whose words, "The greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it." And that is what prompted me to go out and take my first action on my own, which was to plant my first tree on my 8th birthday, which is also World Environment Day. And as my work evolved, I gradually realized how grossly our environment was being abused and compromised, and with its impacts being felt mostly by people and communities who were least responsible for it. So I continued my work on the ground for about 5 years, and then I was invited to, as the youngest international delegate at the Rio Plus 20 Earth Summit in Brazil, where there were 50,000 delegates, but only 5 people under the age of 18, which I was really shocked by, this lack of inclusivity of children. And that is what led me to start Green Hope Foundation to really provide children and youth, and slowly as we expanded, women, girls, vulnerable communities with a platform that would build their awareness and provide them with the tools and infrastructure to lead substantive action both locally and globally. And what began as a 12-year-old dream has now evolved into an EcoSoc accredited global social innovation enterprise, which, as I mentioned earlier, works in 25 countries. And we've directly built resilience with over 225,000 people all across the world. Now, we recognize how climate change amplifies social inequities, including poverty all across the world. So our relief work really focuses on these most vulnerable communities in order to provide them with the tools for self-empowerment, never charity, but tools for self-empowerment. And in these same areas, we see how climate change intensifies food insecurity, for instance. So to mitigate this problem, we've instituted poultry distribution programs for women where they keep 40% of the produce for themselves and sell the rest, so then they're able to use that money to send their daughters, especially, to school. And I'll talk about this later, but to our schools that are powered by solar energy that we then provide them with climate resilience education with. And similarly, we provide them with training on organic farming, composting, distributing organic seeds to them to really move them away from growing the cash crops with the demand that comes in from the city that really destroys their fields, and even more so with climate change. And similarly, we plant indigenous fruit trees with them as well, so that they're able to use that income to help themselves and their families. Now, our Grow Your Own Food campaign has grown in tremendous popularity, especially during the pandemic, and actually both urban and rural areas. And this is really focused to make sure that children are able to learn from a young age why climate smart ways of creating a circular bioeconomy is so important, and how they can do that in their own zones of influence, so in their homes and in their schools. So we've seen our youngest members grow papayas, mangoes, cucumbers, strawberries, all kinds of fruits and vegetables, and they make their own compost as well. Now, I mentioned earlier how education for sustainable development is at the core of the work we do at Green Hope Foundation, because knowledge gives us the power to take actions on the ground. And we've conducted over 600 resilience building academies from Liberia to Vietnam. And since most of the communities we work with, the children have never been to school, or there's a language barrier, or it's a complicated topic to talk about, we use fun ways of learning such as music, art, dance, drama, sport, eco-fashion, writing to spread awareness. And more, for example, our sports campaigns with soccer and kickball and cricket, it really teaches the children about all of these inequities, from gender inequalities to climate change, and at the same time it allows them to have fun and learn there. So, and particularly we focus on girls playing sports, particularly in extremely conservative communities. So this is one of the communities in Western India that we work with to really provide them with another outlet for expressing their views and ideas. Now, a lot of our activities also focus on educating the educator, so that teachers are equipped with, in both formal and non-formal settings, are equipped with the knowledge to impart to their students in terms of climate resilience education. And during the pandemic, we've continued this dialogue online with our 95 plus webinars with heads of states, former heads of states such as Mary Robinson, former prime ministers of Greece and Canada, as well as amazing young women working on the ground who are bringing about change every day, all from Bangladesh to Kiribati to Suriname. And we've continued our academies as well, so that the learning never stops. And this we've done from Democratic Republic of the Congo to India. Now, I speak a lot.
Let me interrupt you for 1 second. I definitely want to let you finish because I want to hear the rest of this, but I know there's people that have to jump off on the top of the hour. So let me just say thank you to whoever has to jump off, and direct you to df4cr.org, where there's a lot of information, including research results from our partners that joined us today. And thanks from BFA, and Kehkashan, back to you.
Amazing. Thank you. So as I was saying, I spoke earlier about women and girls and why that's so important that we engage them. And we all really know how it has disproportionate impacts on women and girls. And the additional complexity that arises is from the fact that there is really no single set of gender inequality reducing policies that applies to all countries and in all contexts. So women's issues are really just swept under the rug, including especially in climate change related contexts. So we address that through sustainable finance, skills-based education, sustainable farming, sustainable fishing, workshops, and protection from sexual assault. And we've seen in these same communities how there is a severe lack of access to clean water and sanitation. So, for instance, here in rural Kenya, we've provided the communities with storage containers that the girls and women can store the water in. So the girls especially don't have to walk in the sun every single day to fetch water, and instead use that time to go to school. And similarly, during the pandemic, we saw an amplification of this lack of access. We started out by distributing water filters to several communities, and then we built deep bore tube wells to provide clean arsenic-free water. We've built toilets, and especially next to schools in rural communities, this is in Bangladesh, so that girls can feel safe from sexual harassment when they've gone to school. And then we provide them with the climate resilience education in those schools. And we've built rainwater harvesting systems as well to really make use of the heavy monsoons that come as a result of climate change. In these same communities, we've also seen how there's a severe lack of access to clean and affordable energy. So we've distributed solar lamps from across Nepal, the Sundarbans, the Rann of Kutch, and we've installed solar streetlights in several communities around the world to provide safe spaces for women and girls in these climate vulnerable areas, as well as solar grids. So this right here is the school that I was talking about earlier. So solar panels on homes, schools, community centers. And all of this right here is in Liberia, all of these help to power education and ensure that the children and the girls and the women aren't left behind. And particularly in Liberia, we have computer literacy programs that are powered by solar energy so that the children, and especially the girls, get the necessary skill sets that will allow them to get good jobs and uplift their communities out of poverty. We've also distributed solar cookers, and we provide them with necessary training to migrant women workers in Western India so that they have a safe and affordable way of cooking their food for their children and themselves. And during the pandemic, we've seen how there's been an exacerbation of lack of access to education, with many of the children, especially girls, dropping out of school. So our solar-powered mobile libraries are now taking books directly to the doorstep of over 250,000 children all across the world to really ensure that they don't they're not cut off from their education permanently, which has happened, unfortunately, in many parts of the world. And we also work extensively on climate smart agriculture. So we've installed solar irrigation systems to make sure that women farmers and young farmers can practice climate smart agriculture as well. Now, we also work in coastal communities, so working with several communities that are especially matriarchal, working with them on sustainable fishing practices. We've also started sewing schools to allow women and girls to have a stable source of income, especially during the pandemic, so they can sell their clothes, masks, bags, and then use that money to get an education or send their daughters to school. And we've one of the panelists talked earlier about the digital divide, and we've seen firsthand how terribly that's affected children all across the world. So we've installed routers in several villages as well affected by climate change, so that the children, especially during this pandemic, can connect to online learning and to our online academies, which we've continued now with them. So really, all of our work is to reduce inequalities all around the world, whether it's engaging with the children in the Rohingya refugee camps in Kutupalong, the Syrian refugee camps, homes for children of prisoners, homes for children with HIV/AIDS. It's really, these are the children who are left behind most often, and their needs and wants aren't considered. So our work is really to reduce these inequalities in the face of climate change, war, strife. And at the same time, we also engage with other generations as well to practice intergenerational solidarity by conducting workshops at retirement homes and engaging with those who were activists when they were younger. And the knowledge sharing, it's truly amazing. Now, I've spoken a lot about the work, like the education workshops and the academies that we do, but all of that turns into ground level action as well. So with our 225,000 children and young people and women all across the world, we've conducted over 638 cleanups of parks, beaches, canals, ravines all around the world. We've recycled over 250,000 kilos of waste, planted more than 400,000 trees. We work extensively on turtle conservation, both sea and river. We've planted more than 7,000 mangroves, especially in areas that are extremely affected by cyclones and hurricanes to protect the communities from climate-induced disasters. And we work on peace and nuclear disarmament, particularly on how climate change creates a lack of peace, and how the funds that go into creating weapons of mass destruction must be moved from fueling annihilation and instead move towards helping communities and making sure that no one's left behind. So we've engaged with dialogues from the UN Secretary General to ground level campaigns with our We Want Bugs Not Nukes campaign, our peace song, our debates, as well as continuing our engagement with children through music and art, where we provide them with disarmament education.
Kehkashan, I think we're unfortunately we're totally out of time.
This is my last.
Okay, great.
Right. And finally, we believe in the power of partnerships. So really working together to create a sustainable world for all and making sure that no one is left behind. So since we are out of time, I'll just very quickly say that, we are creating an increasingly broken and unlivable planet all across the world, and we're seeing the signs every single day. It's absolutely imperative that we come together, not just play the blame game and say that it's someone else's problem to solve because we didn't put this in place, but actually hold ourselves accountable and ensure that we understand lived experiences, bring those to the table, and really build forward better through the lens of human and planetary justice for all. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for your time. Kehkashan, enjoy the rest of COP26. I hope you guys get us sorted out. Everybody have a good rest of your week.
Thank you.